Quisiera entonces solicitar si hay preguntas. Si han llenado las preguntas ahí, hay una. Vamos a hacer dos rondas de 3 preguntas. La primera pregunta entonces, es desde el punto de vista de la libertad y el pluralismo, ¿cómo se enfrentan prácticas de justicia indígena como el linchamiento que practican algunas comunidades en Bolivia?
Yeah, what I argue is that the capabilities are fundamental rights of all people and cannot be abridged on grounds of tradition or religion. So if a given cultural practice requires violation of the fundamental capabilities of other people without their consent, then that practice must be illegal. You know, a good example is that in our legal system, parents may, up to a point, control the treatment of their children, but if on religious grounds they want to deny a child life-saving medical treatment, the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, do that, then that's illegal. Then they're going to be, the custody of that child will be taken away from them, or else they have to accept the needed medical treatment. So in general, whenever it's one of these capabilities that's at risk, life, health, whatever, then culture doesn't justify it.
Thank you. Vamos a probar con esta. ¿Cómo puede explicar el enfoque de capacidades al sujeto colectivo, familias, comunidades, considerando que la política pública se orienta principalmente a la familia como objeto? ¿El funcionamiento no sería una suma de capacidades individuales de cada miembro? ¿Considera procesos de emergencia y construcción de capacidades colectivas que se potencien desde la política pública?
Okay, the last sentence didn't make much sense to me, but anyway, the capability of affiliation is very central. Human beings have deep needs for relationships of love and care, and any decent public policy will therefore protect affiliations of many kinds, including families, but also including organizations that bring people together either for religious purposes, for purposes of solidarity, such as the women's group that Vasanti was a member of, and many others. Now, therefore, it's quite tricky to balance the rights given to that collectivity against the rights of individuals. How much control should families have over the lives of their members? Well, I think the first thing to say is we have to, first of all, see the problem. The dominant theory of the family used by economists for many, many years was the theory of my University of Chicago colleague Gary Becker, who said that the family was just a single unit. And you could, as your question suggests, aggregate all the functionings of all its members. Indeed, he assumed that the head of the household is a beneficent altruist who will distribute adequately the things that come into the family, and so we didn't even need to look at distribution within the family. That tremendously influenced the way that data were gathered. So we would have household data, but we didn't have data about how girl children were doing, how boy children were doing, you know. And it's been a real struggle over the last 30 years even to get adequate data about distribution. But by now, economists have gone over to a different paradigm for the analysis of the family, which is a bargaining model, because they understand that families, of course, are not only beneficent. They involve struggles over scarce resources and the allocation of opportunities, which is not always done fairly. So the bargaining model shows us lots of things, such as the fact that women often get less food than men, that girl children are taken less often to the doctor when they're ill, and so on. So, you know, then the theoretical question becomes, how do we balance the importance of the love and care that ideally exist within that structure against the reality that opportunities are often very unequally allocated to people within that structure? The first thing to say is that one solution to this is the one I already mentioned. That is, when health or life are at risk, then government must not allow the parents to be unfair to children in that way. If girl children are dying because they're being neglected, well, then the parent has got to do better, or else they'll lose custody of that child. The next thing to say is this isn't only about life, but it's also about education. John Stuart Mill already argued in about 1848 in the Principles of Political Economy that the deprivation of education that parents sometimes do to their children, whether male or female, was a harm just as much as violence to the body, and it ought to be illegal. And so the state, he argued, ought to promote compulsory free education for all children, and then they ought to enforce that. Well, of course, most nations now do that. I mean, that, in a way, that's not an argument, but they need to do more to make sure that that education is adequate, that it's relatively equal, and the distribution of education to rich and poor should not be a source of the crippling of the life opportunities of some children. So anyway, you know, the parents get certain rights over their children, but not the right to deprive them of any of the capabilities on this list.
Okay. Hay una pregunta hecha en inglés. Which is the difference between virtues and capacities?
Oh. Okay. Virtues and capacities. Well, you know, of course, both of them are different, are hard to define. The standard distinction, if you're thinking about Aristotelian philosophy, would be that virtues are not just capacities because they include desire. They include, so if you're courageous, it's not just that you know how to behave courageously, but you also have become a person who wants to behave courageously. And so that's the distinction. But my capabilities are really neither one. They're partly capacities. I have a distinction that I use called internal capabilities and combined capabilities. Now, internal capabilities are really capacities. That is, they're the developed powers of mind and body, such that if you're in the right circumstances, you can go out and exercise that function. But already there, the circumstances come in, because you will not have the internal capability to participate in politics unless you've had a good education, unless your family has given you emotional health and so on. So even to get those capacities, you need good public policy. But then you might have those developed capacities and still not be able to choose the functioning because you're in the wrong situation. Your circumstances have not been constructed in a way that makes you capable of really making that choice. Most people all over the world are capable of exercising their conscience in accordance with the religious or secular view of their choice, but in many nations they can't do that because there's no religious freedom. Again, most people are capable of speaking their mind about politics, but they can't always do that. So that's the distinction between internal capability and combined capability. So what good public policy will do is to produce the internal capability or capacity, but then it will also produce circumstances that make it possible for the person to really choose. And what about virtue? Well, I've said nothing about what people want, but actually, I do believe that if people are going to sustain institutions that are just, and they're going to not just appear in 1935 and then disappear in 1980, I'm talking about my own country now, then they better be encouraged to love that and to want that. So public policy also has a job of creating sentiments that support the political institutions of a decent society. I think the great political leaders all over the world have understood that. Gandhi was one of the greatest mobilizers of sentiment in world history. He knew that getting a just society meant making people willing to sacrifice for others and care about others. So in my own country, I think people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln also understood that producing a just society is a matter of creating real virtues, not just capacities. And that's the topic of the book I'm working on now. So you'll see in a couple of years, you'll see what I'll say.
Thank you, Martha. Since what stage of development a human being has dignity?
Now, of course, that's a very disputed point. And so my view is not the same as the most traditional views. Traditional views hold that human dignity is based on some specific capacity. Usually they pick rationality. And so then they have to answer the question, at what age does a creature become rational? And there are many different answers to that question. Some say shortly before birth, some say at birth, and so on. My view, because I've been very focused on the equal dignity of people with severe cognitive impairments, is that we should not look for one specific capacity, but rather just birth to human parents plus some type of agency. In other words, I want to exclude only people in a permanent vegetative condition and perhaps a child who is anencephalic, who has no measurable brain activity. And so, in other words, I want to say that, you know, if you don't have the capacity to speak or reason, but you do have the capacity to have emotions and love people, and that's the case for a lot of disabled children, that's you're fully, equally a human being. And so at what time does that person come into being? I would just say at birth, because I think it's at birth that our ability to interact with the world around us comes in. Now, of course, then in politics, we're always going to have to talk and argue with people who think that human dignity begins earlier than that. And that's one of those areas which do deeply divide people in accordance with their religious conception. I actually think that the first thing we should say to those people is, are you really consistent? Do you really think that equal human dignity begins at conception? Because if you do, given that we know that approximately 90% of all fertilized eggs do not implant just naturally, what are you doing about that? Are you going to try to have a rescue operation of all the eggs that by just natural menstrual processes do not implant? Well, they don't do that. They don't worry about that. So that suggests that they're not actually fully consistent. So we need to probe further and find out what the nature of their view really is. And I think, you know, once we get a consistent view, then we could then debate it, and then we could ask what a divided society should do about that, what kinds of choices we think are important for women's health and women's agency, and what sorts of concessions we make to the religious sensitivity of many people. And I guess what I think is that a reasonable right of abortion in the first trimester is a defensible public policy, and that it shouldn't be required that an individual, doctor, pharmacist, or whatever, should participate in that if it goes against their conscience. So there should be accommodation for individuals on grounds of conscience.
Thank you, Marta. Well, there is a very long question that I will try to resume. There are two. They said the following, that knowing the orientation of the economics school of the University of Chicago, what is the level of interdisciplinary dialogue and collaboration in the campus?
Okay. Okay. Well, you know, the first thing to say is that I think even historically, the Chicago School was very diverse. The founder of the Chicago School was Frank Knight, whose great work on risk and uncertainty was very much on the left in terms of the American political scene, and he, in later life, strongly criticized both Stigler and Friedman, saying that their version of Chicago School was wrong. So there was always argument and debate. And, but more recently, you know, the whole atmosphere is very diverse. James Heckman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2000 for his work on child poverty and early educational interventions, is a close colleague of mine, and we do cooperative projects together. Heckman is, of course, at Chicago. He's part of the Chicago School, if there is one. And, you know, we also have in the law school, since law and economics is a discipline that inevitably is dealing with reality all the time, not just theory, it's not too surprising that law and economics, although founded by two relatively conservative people, that is Richard Posner and George Stigler, has become enormously diverse in terms of the political normative views of the people who practice it. It's also methodologically diverse in terms of the way that people use philosophy, political philosophy in their approaches. Posner himself, you may know, has changed his view. He's become a Keynesian. So he himself, I teach a lot with Dick Posner, and it's always surprising to try to find out what he's going to say next. So, but anyway, an example is that my colleague, who's an expert in tax policy, David Weisbach, we taught a class together on distribution, taxes, and social justice, where we looked at normative political philosophy and the tax policy literature, and we put that together. And next year we're teaching a seminar on global justice. So, you know, that's the kind of cooperation between philosophy and economics that goes on. I'm just now reading, while I'm here in Chile, the new book by David Weisbach and Eric Posner, who's the son of Richard Posner, but he's a leading law and economics person in our law school, called Climate Change Justice, where they're unequivocally stating that richer countries must distribute much more to support the poorer countries. They then dispute how it should be done, and they don't think that climate change is the best way to do it, and so on. But anyway, they are definitely urging much more international redistribution. So that just gives you a sense of how law and economics is not what you might have thought it would be. And I don't think there's anyone at our law school who actually supports an unregulated economy. I don't know one. Another area where we had a kind of a book in which lots of us contributed from many parts of the law school, and it was called, the book is called The Offensive Internet, Speech, Privacy, and Reputation, in which people who are concerned with gender studies, philosophy, law and economics all got together to talk about the future of the internet. And the united conclusion, although people were not trying to reach a united conclusion, but actually, if you want to say there's a Chicago school, it's that we all think greater regulation of speech on the internet, which is much less regulated than print media, in order to protect individual privacy and individual dignity. So anyway, it's a new world, and there are many forms of collaboration. Since I'm very concerned myself with literature, and have brought that to the law school. I can also report that it's not only the case that Richard Posner and I every single year teach a law and literature course together, but also every 2 years we now have a law and literature conference, and more of my colleagues have been eagerly volunteering to write papers on that sort of topic. We just gave one which was on manhood in American law and literature. And, you know, people from corporate law, people from theoretical law and economics, they were all writing papers on Theodore Dreiser, William Faulkner. It's extraordinary. Now, and more people are joining in. So I think it's a very, very interdisciplinary atmosphere.
Muchas gracias, Marta. Bueno, hemos llegado a la hora límite de nuestra conferencia. Les pido excusa a quienes no pudimos plantearle las preguntas a Marta, y quiero agradecer nuevamente a Marta por su magnífica conferencia, por su respuesta y por la generosidad de estar con nosotros. Thank you.
Thank you very much.